One late night, I was walking along the path with my friend. Suddenly, I heard someone from behind us speaking quietly. "Don't look back. Don't look back. If you look back, if you do that." I stopped in amazement. There was silence for a few seconds. And behind me, I could hear something ripping and a groan of pain that I don't know whether it was an animal or a human. Being seized with fear, I clenched my teeth to stop my instinctive curiosity to look back. However, when I took a peek at my friend Ken, he who seemed couldn't resist curiosity, has been already looked back. Ken, who thought someone was fooling around, was smiling and looking around to see who it was. Although we couldn't see around it because it was dark already, he seemed to think it was no big deal. Just then, I heard someone scream, "If you look back, you are going to die!" Something flew in and stuck in Ken's body, and a moment later, he fell to the ground groaning. The knife was stuck in his leg when I looked at him in extreme fear. He screamed and shouted, "Don't look back! Run!" I grabbed his arm and ran away like crazy. I heard a chasing sound from behind, but didn't have the courage to look back though. "I'm starving! Give it to me!" The man shouted, and when I glanced back, I could see him laughing, bleeding from his mouth, and following us like a mad, holding a knife in his hand. Ken, who was limping at that moment, was soon caught by him. To my surprise, he grabbed Ken's leg and tried to cut out the flesh with a knife. It was like he was cutting steak something. I kicked him as hard as I could, and he was eventually knocked out. We barely managed to escape and were able to get away from him. We hid somewhere and ended up calling the police. Soon, there was the sound of a police car. I took a look at Ken's condition, and his leg's flesh was torn apart. When I asked him what had happened, Ken then replied in pain. The moment Ken looked back, he saw a homeless man who was eating something alive raw. And that man threw the knife he was holding at Ken when he met his eyes. The police later arrested him and also found a man whose flesh had been torn apart from his entire body. It turned out that man was eaten alive. Barely breathing, he eventually died on his way to the emergency room. The victim, who was drunk, fell unconscious on the floor at the time and was eaten by a homeless man. I still can't forget Ken's deathly pale face. If I had failed to run away that day, I might be lost some part of my body too.
It was a dark, scary Halloween night in 2020. There were many kids having a fun trick-or-treating, and the adults were giving out their candies. There was a group of kids who stood out whose names were Bob, Jimmy, Nick, Cameron, and Clyde. They were out all night trying to get as much candy as they could get. After they were done, they went to a bench and started eating and trading their candy. They then started to feel bored. There was nothing to do for the rest of the night. Jimmy had an idea.
Guys, let's go explore the abandoned hospital down the road. I've heard it's super scary and there's a clown inside,
he said. The rest of the group agreed to go. It was around 11 p.m. when they got there. The hospital was gigantic, with it being around 20 floors tall and was wide. As the only girl in the group, Cameron said she was way too scared to go to the hospital. She ended up running back home. There were only 4. When they went in, they could smell the dead bodies of rats and the mold that was growing in. You could see all the equipment still there and the beds scattered everywhere, with blood on the floor. After walking around for a bit, the whole group noticed that they saw something running behind them every couple of minutes. However, they didn't have any clue what it was. Then, they heard a voice telling them to get out multiple times.
Get out.
A couple of minutes later, they heard a piercing scream. The group looked around and realized that Clyde had disappeared. That's when it got serious. They were terrified and wanted to leave, but the doors latched shut from the outside and they were on the 12th floor.
I think it's the one, the clown! Clyde! Clyde, where are you?
Teary-eyed, Jimmy started yelling for Clyde. They soon accepted their situation and gave up. Nick went into one of the rooms and found many used syringes that they used to draw blood in. They took some, split up, and went to defend themselves. Since Bob was the one who was scared of little things, he just closed his eyes and swung his arm with the syringe. Jimmy, on the other hand, wanted to hunt down that clown and save their friend Clyde. Nick was just wandering around the hospital trying to find a fire escape, and there he was. About 12 feet away from him, the clown was standing there. He screamed,
Get out of my hospital!
However, instead of running away, Nick ran towards the clown as fast as he could, slid in between his legs, stabbed his back with the syringe, and finally ran out of the exit. He managed to unlatch the door and yelled for his friends to come back down, and the rest of them also succeeded in escaping.
I'm going inside again. I have to save Clyde.
When Nick told his friends, everyone tried to stop him, but he rushed inside. While he was going up the stairs, he found a baseball bat and grabbed it. After more walking, he found the clown in front of him limping.
What did you do to my friend, you bastard?
He yelled, but the clown just laughed like he was insane. Just then, he heard someone saying, "Help me," with a small voice. This time, he hit the clown right in the mouth with the baseball bat and ran towards the voice. He found Clyde locked in a room.
Let's get the hell out of here.
They started to run down another fire exit. When they were halfway there, they heard heavy footsteps above them. They all knew who it was. They gave it everything they got. They ran down the stairs as fast as they could and escaped from the hospital. While Nick and his friends were running away to the police station, they reported that they saw a clown in the abandoned hospital. To their surprise, when the police arrived at the hospital and checked inside, there was no one in there. The clown was never to be seen again. I've been in between jobs ever since I left college, doing different things here and there, odd jobs sometimes. It wasn't until I started as a 911 operator that I realized that's what I really wanted to do with my life. But it'd only been about 4 months when I received one of the most chilling, unexplainable, and spine-tingling phone calls of my life. The night it happened was a particularly grueling shift. I'd spent the last 10 hours dispatching police for the various houses. I was about 2 hours from finishing when I received a call from a little girl named Samantha. The following is a transcript of that call.
911 operator, what's your emergency?
Hello? Mommy's fallen over. What's your name, honey?
Samantha.
Okay, Samantha, can you tell me where you live?
I don't know the address. Can you find me?
Yes, Samantha, I can trace the call. Can you tell me what happened? Mommy's been acting all weird the past few days. Not sleeping at nights, going around scratching at the walls. I'm too scared to come out of my room. I was in bed and I started hearing this weird moaning sound. Mommy sounded like a zombie. And that's when I heard someone giggle. What's Mommy doing right now, Samantha? Mommy's on the floor right now. She won't get up.
Is she breathing?
I don't know. I can't see her chest moving. I'm scared. It's okay, honey. Help is on the way. I'll need you to stay on the line until they arrive. Can you do that?
Yes, something's happening. What's happening?
Mommy's twitching now. Her eyes are fluttering. That's when I hear the distinct sounds of someone moaning and the sounds of someone dragging something. I could hear Samantha's whimpering.
Is someone coming? I'm scared.
Yes, Samantha, they're not far away. What are those noises?
It's Mommy.
Samantha, what's Mommy doing? I'm hiding in my wardrobe. She's crawling on the floor like a tarantula. Her eyes have gone all weird. She's hissing and this weird foamy stuff is coming out of her mouth.
Can she see you?
I don't think she can see me yet. Is someone coming? Are they close? Yes, very close. Just then, I heard Samantha whisper something.
Samantha, are you okay?
Mommy's walking backwards now. I think she knows where I am. Her black eyes are looking right at me. Please, I'm scared. Mommy's trying to hurt me. Samantha, what do you mean your mommy's walking backwards? It's all upside down. Her legs are twisted the wrong way. Her body is normal, but her head is all backwards too. Do you know when you twist your Barbie's head? It's like that. She's shaking as she walks, kind of like a robot. She's coming! Samantha, the police are right around the corner.
Mommy's smiling now. I think it's okay for me to come out.
Samantha, stay where you are. Mommy?
Samantha? Samantha, the police are right outside. Mommy, please stop. You're scaring me. Samantha? Samantha.
I don't want to eat that, Mommy.
What do you mean it'll make me just like you? Where are we going, Mommy?
Just then, I heard a piercing scream, and the line went dead. When the police finally arrived at the scene, they neither found Samantha nor her mother. In fact, the house didn't look like someone had ever lived in it. They reported that the lights didn't work at all. There was no furniture, and they found the decaying corpse of a dog which looked to have been dead for weeks in the middle of the living room. Insects, maggots, all kinds of detestable things were found slithering around the house, but not a trace of any living human being. Eventually, I quit my job the very next morning. That call has haunted me ever since then. I just couldn't comprehend my experience. My boss and the other officers were all adamant that they were sent to the wrong address. It was all deemed the fault of the dispatcher, me. But I know I wasn't wrong. I know the address was right, and I know there was no error in the system. It wasn't my fault. I think about Samantha every day, and I pray that nothing bad happened to her. However, deep in my heart, I know that someone was pretending to be her mother, and that someone did something unspeakable to her, something unthinkable. I will never forget that scream.
This is a disturbing story that happened to me about 4 years ago. It was around December. The snowstorms were starting to come in, and it was becoming very cold. Me and my wife were trying to get everything we could before winter started, mainly food and supplies. The problem was that we didn't have a car. We couldn't afford it. I worked a low-wage job and was making enough to barely pay rent on our shitty old apartment. My wife usually stayed home and took care of our 2-month-old baby, and I was doing the best I could to save enough money for a car. And finally, after months of saving, I had enough. One day I came home and told my wife the good news, and she was relieved. The next day we went to our local car dealership. There was only 2 cars on the lot, and they weren't the greatest, but the prices were very low, and as long as it got us from point A to point B, we would be happy. So we did what we needed to, paid for it, got the keys, and drove off. The car was from 1984 and was pretty run down, but it drove just fine. 6 months later, I was cleaning out the car when I noticed something odd under the back seat. It was something that I had never seen before. Despite having checked the car multiple times at this point, I looked closer, but I would need a flashlight in order to see it clearly. It looked like a black box of some kind. I thought it was just something the previous owner had left behind. Finally, curiosity got the best of me and I pulled it out of the car. It was an old VHS tape, marked Happy Memories. It looked to be around the same age as the car. I didn't know what to do with it. I just thought it was some old home video from the previous owner, although it was pretty strange that it was hiding underneath the seat. While I didn't want to invade anyone's privacy, I decided that I wanted to see what was on the tape to satisfy my curiosity. I went up to my attic and found my old VHS player. I hadn't used it since high school, back when I threw parties and me and my buddies would watch movies on it. It was a bit dusty, but it still worked just fine. I turned it on and put in the tape. It started off pretty normal. It was a family during Christmas, people walking around, opening gifts, etc. Then things got a little uncomfortable. The husband and wife began arguing while the children were crying in the background. The argument got more and more intense as it went on. I could not make out exactly what was being said. The camera cut off and the screen was black, before cutting back into a scene that was so fucked up that it kept me up for weeks after. I will never get this image out of my head. The camera was now set up in a dark room. There was torture weapons hanging from the walls and dismembered body parts scattered across the floor. The same wife and children from the beginning were now on their knees chained together and sobbing. That's about as much detail as I'm willing to go into. There was also a man in the room whose face was cut off from the camera's view. The man stepped out of frame and switched off the overhead light. And what he said next won't stop repeating in my head. I guess this is a happy memory for someone like me. After that, all that was heard was the horrified screams of the family. I had to turn off the tape. I couldn't take it anymore. I took the tape out and just stared at it for what seemed like hours. The images of the bodies, all the blood, the terrified faces of the family were now burnt into my mind. It was hours before I said a single word to anyone. I eventually called the police and explained what I had found. After weeks of investigation, they found out that this tape was of a family who had gone missing 32 years ago. They said that their house was demolished in 2003, and a car dealership was built in its place. The exact same place where I got the car. That's when it hit me. Thinking back, the car salesman looked a lot like the husband from the beginning of the video, except a lot older. Now that I think about it, he was kind of in a hurry to get us out of there after we bought the car, shortly after the shop was closed down, and is now abandoned. A lot of my friends went there over the years and said it was a really good place for a cheap car. I would pass it every day driving to work. I'm assuming the police followed up on all of this during their investigation, but I never heard of any arrests being made or further updates on the case. As far as I know, that man is still out there.
My name is Skylar, and this happened to me when I was 12. It was a Saturday afternoon. My cousins were staying with my family over the weekend. My parents had to head over to the store, and my cousins and I decided to go to the nearby park to play. Before we left, we made sure the door was locked like we were supposed to. However, by the time we came back, I could see the door was open. There were even scratch marks on the handle, as if someone had tried to pick the lock by force. My older cousin Sam called my parents, and they said they were on their way. Stupidly, we thought the intruder had left already, so we ended up going into the house. That was a mistake. My younger cousin, who was 9 years old at the time, had to go to the bathroom, but when he stepped out, his face was frozen with fear. We asked him what happened, but he couldn't speak at all, just pointed at the bathroom. I slowly opened the door, and what I saw made my heart drop. A blood-soaked man was dead in the bathtub. I checked if he was breathing, but couldn't feel anything. It looked as if someone had attacked him. My cousins and I started panicking, realizing that there must be a second intruder somewhere in the house. We cowered together in the living room and waited for my parents. When they finally arrived, they called the police right away. During their investigation, they found out that those two men had escaped from a mental hospital nearby. It turned out that they were both trying to rob my house, when one of the men lost his mind and ended up killing the other. From that day on, my parents never dared leave me home alone. I always double-check the door before I leave. Now I'm 15 years old, and my family has moved to Florida. However, I don't think I will ever forget the memory of that dead man in our bathtub. My name is Alexa, and this happened a month ago while I was having a sleepover at my friend's house. I'm going to call her Kate. Kate is 3 years older than me. I'm 11. We were in Kate's room when her mother told us that she had to head over to the hospital. She said, "Girls, close the windows and lock all the doors, okay?" After she left, we went to the living room to play with Kate's dog. About an hour passed and we got kind of bored. So we ended up going out and heading to a 7-Eleven to get some snacks and chips. When we got back, I noticed that the door was just slightly open. Kate noticed it too. We were confused. Had we really left it open like that? We ended up just shrugging it off and going inside. Kate locked the door behind us. When we got up to her room, Kate's dog was there, barking at her closet. "Stop," Kate told her, but she kept barking relentlessly. Just then, though, I suddenly remembered the closet door had been wide open when we left. I was puzzled and started to feel a little scared at the same time. I slowly grabbed her baseball bat and swung open the closet door. What I saw inside was a clown with horrific makeup and a costume. And then I saw the knife in his hand. As soon as he saw me, he tried to stand up, but I started to swing the bat over and over, screaming. I couldn't stop even while Kate was calling the police. Just before he passed out, I could definitely hear him say, "Y'all can't escape. There are more of us out there." When the police finally arrived, we told them everything. While the clown was dragged out of the house, he kept staring and grinning at me. His smile and what he told me still creeps me out.
This happened to my father one stormy night in Glenwood, Colorado. It was the 1980s. My father was an electrical engineer who was just returning from a job site. He worked long hours, and it wasn't uncommon for him to be heading home around midnight to the small cabin he shared with a friend tucked back in the canyon walls. It was pouring rain. Lightning flashed only to illuminate the murky puddled patches of washed-out terrain. As my father rounded the corner upon the dirt road, he passed a large willow tree. As his headlights crossed its base, he noticed someone was crouched underneath it. It was a woman who seemed to be in her late 20s, with long tangled blonde hair. She had on fairly casual clothing, and carried a somewhat large bundle under her arms wrapped in cloth. My father, being the gentleman that he was, decided to pull over and offered her to take shelter from the storm in his cabin, just up the road. She smiled and thanked him. As she got into his vehicle, she explained that she had been on a hike through the canyon that day when the storm hit, and she had been caught off guard by the rain. Dad smiled and pointed out that she wasn't exactly wearing the best clothing or shoes to go on a hike. She laughed and said that she had left her place on a whim unprepared. He asked if she needed him to dry anything at his place, pointing to the bundle she held tightly under her arm. Her voice suddenly got very stern and stated no. When my father asked her where she lived around the area, things started to get strange. She started telling my dad that she had no friends or family in the area and was quite vague when asked about details of where she lived. All she responded with was that it was too far to drive to tonight in this kind of weather. At this point, my dad said he felt that she was a bit off, but chalked it up to her exhaustion from hiking and standing out in the storm for several hours. As they entered the cabin, my dad remembered that his roommate had left that morning to take a trip out of town and wouldn't be back for several days. My dad would have offered her his friend's room, but wouldn't feel comfortable doing that without her permission. Remember, this was the 1980s. Pocket cell phones weren't on everyone yet. My dad told her that she was welcome to sleep on the couch and dry off as he handed her several towels. She took them from him with her right hand, but still never let go of the bundle she hugged under her left arm. My dad at this point realized that she had never given him her name, so he introduced himself. "Nice to meet you. My name is Mary Lou," she replied. My father started to feel a bit more at ease and turned on the television for her and handed over the remote. She scanned through the channels, finally deciding on a gangster flick. There was a scene that involved a bunch of mobsters getting shot to pieces. Mary found this to be quite amusing and started to laugh in a crackling, high-pitched tone. My dad started to get a bit creeped out by this. She was enjoying it a little too much, he said. Then my dad asked her about her life, and things took a turn for the worse. When asked if she was in a relationship, she pointed down at her belt buckle and told my dad the story of her breakup. She claimed her last boyfriend wanted to be domineering over her, and to this she responded by bludgeoning him half to death in his gravel driveway with her belt buckle, the same one she was wearing. He kept saying stop, please stop, and begging, but I wouldn't show him mercy, she said, with a note of pride in her voice. My dad asked if he had been abusing her, or if she was reacting defensively, and she merely scoffed and said, no, otherwise he would be dead. My father's unease grew as the conversations progressed. She told him about her mother dying on the operating table and how the surgeon who had been working on her walked out covered in blood and said that she would be fine. How is she supposed to be okay with all of her guts in the trash can? She spewed. Then she laughed again, glancing back at the TV screen, littered with disheveled, bullet-ridden corpses. I love the sight of blood. It excites me, turns me on, you know. Death. Draining them to death. At this point, my dad was officially done. He was bigger and stronger than she was, and he was quite streetwise as well, and had seen plenty of horrors in his life. But the way she spoke with a violent confidence, combined with her sure grip upon the bundle which lay under her arm, sent chills down his spine. He needed a plan. Finally, an idea popped into my father's head. I have a friend who's a priest in town. He has access to plenty of shelters funded by the church. You would be a lot more comfortable there instead of on our couch. They can feed you too, and arrange a ride for you to get home in the morning. I can call him right now. He's only a few miles from here, he stated reassuringly. Mary Lou's tone brightened to match his. That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. My father smiled, hiding his relief. Of course, it's the least I could do for you. As my dad walked over to the phone and began to dial the number, Mary Lou erupted in a low guttural growl. I hate priests. I hate priests. She said it with a tired hatred, a clear, distinct, audible, whispered disdain from the bottom of her heart with an unflinching resolve. My dad had enough. This wasn't a game to play anymore. This was beyond a stranger with odd tendencies. A darkness with coiled cruelty had crossed the threshold of his door. You need to leave, and you need to leave now, my dad said, pointing to the front of the cabin. There's the door. I can't have you here and feel comfortable. I'm sorry, but the storm has stopped, and I hate to have you walk in the dark, but that's the way this has to go. Please leave. Mary Lou gazed upon him, expressionless, and finally just shrugged. My father walked her out, standing close to her, in the event that the bundle concealed some type of weapon. He wasn't taking any chances. She smiled at him as she slowly walked onto the front porch. Goodbye for now. I'll see you when I see you, she said calmly. With that, she walked down the long dirt road, with a single streetlight upon its path. She looked back at him one last time, before crossing the light and disappearing, enveloped by the darkness with no trace of her to be seen. My dad called the police the next day, concerned that she may still be hiding on his premises somewhere, after speaking to his girlfriend about it, who is now my mom, and being convinced by her that she was going to cut the window screen when he was gone, hide in the house, and then kill him. They found nothing, and said the area attracted a lot of transients and nomads. My father then made the mistake of telling his engineer buddies at work, which resulted in them bidding him farewell at the end of each shift, in the form of asking that he say hi to Mary Lou for them. My dad never saw her again. He still questions what could have been in that bundle that she so adamantly protected. he will never know.
This tragic incident happened 3 years ago. I need to explain my family first to help you understand my story. I used to live with my dad, mom, and older brother. Since I was young, my dad always fought with my mom, so my brother and I always spent the night shivering in fear. My mom was full of bruises and scars from being beaten by dad, and there were many times when her life was almost in danger. 3 years ago, it was when I was 17. Being a grown-up, we were already used to Dad's violence. Whenever he got violent, I screamed and threw myself to stop him, but it didn't always stop so easily. My brother would just quietly get out of the house. I understood him. There was really no way to stop our dad. It was the same day as usual. That night as well, my dad threw liquor bottles and cursed at us. He wielded the knife like he was really going to kill us, and my mom got cut and bled while protecting us. I was crying with fear. Then someone knocked on the door outside.
Piss off, you son of a bitch!
My dad shouted. However, the knocking continued. My dad ended up opening the door in anger. To our surprise, a man in a clown costume and mask stood outside. My dad yelled and cursed at the man to get away, but the clown stood there still.
Who the fuck are you?
My dad cursed at him for a long time and turned around. Just then, the moment he turned around, the clown hit his head with a hammer from behind. Dad fell down on the floor and ended up dead while convulsing. And then I heard a sobbing sound. The clown was sobbing, shaking his shoulders like crazy, and walked away. After a while, the police who received the report rushed to the scene and quickly caught the clown. And the moment they unmasked the clown, I collapsed to the floor. I was in a breathtaking shock on the spot. It was my brother. Although tears were flowing from his eyes, I could see he was smiling. He kept muttering as he was arrested by the police. "It's all over now. It's alright. It's alright." To this day, I am unable to forget about that day. I just live in the nightmare. But I never blame him at all. He just wanted to end this hell.
My name is Flora, and I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me 2 years ago. It was my senior year of high school. Everything was going well, and my school results were decent. I got along with my classmates and often talked to everyone. Well, everyone except this one boy who always kept to himself. He was just always drawing quietly in his seat at the back of the class. Everyone took his behavior for shyness, and no one usually talked to him. In fact, I was one of the few who had tried to make him come out of his shell, but he just royally ignored me. For a while, I gave up on the idea of dragging him out of his fortress of loneliness, figuring that he must just have preferred his own company. Then one time, I ran into him in the hall, where he was sitting, and of course drawing into his sketchbook. I decided to give it one more try. "Hi, what are you drawing?" I asked him. As usual, he didn't answer to me, or even acknowledge my presence. He just kept drawing with a blank expression on his face, calm and emotionless. After waiting a while, I ended up leaving him alone. A few days later, I spotted him at the metro station on my way home. The station was pretty empty. There were 3 people there. Me, a man probably in his 40s sitting cross-legged on a bench with his little briefcase, and my mysterious classmate carrying a big sports bag. This time, I chose to not try and talk to him. I didn't feel like getting ignored once again. When the metro arrived, we all got on the same car. What struck me immediately was the stench. Not the smell of sweat or anything, it was more like rotten meat? It's a smell I will never forget. The expression on the 40-year-old man's face clearly indicated surprise and disgust, so I concluded the source of the smell had to be my classmate, or rather his gym bag. I wanted to get a little bit further, to put some distance between myself and his smelly bag as quickly as possible. Suddenly the man in the suit said something that stopped me in my tracks though. "Young man, what is that dripping from your bag?" Small red drops were beating at the base of the bag before falling to the ground, gradually creating a puddle. I started to break out in cold sweat, but had no idea how to react. My classmate remained silent, ignoring us both just as he always ignored me. No one spoke again until the ticket inspector stepped into our car to check our tickets. He also noticed a bottle of red under the bag and hurried to remind my classmate that food was prohibited on the metro. "You're going to have to open your bag," he said. My classmate hesitated, but then slowly began to open the front pocket of the bag. And before any one of us could react to it, he started brandishing a big kitchen knife in our direction, still in complete silence. Luckily, the inspector and the middle-aged man managed to disarm and subdue him quickly. They then asked me to call the police and tell the driver, which, of course, I quickly did. About 10 or 15 minutes later, the police arrived at the next station, where we were waiting. They took my statement and opened his bag. Inside, there were 2 human hands covered in blood. It was horrible. The image is still imprinted in my memory to this day. Later, I learned that my classmate had severe psychological problems, and he continuously drew hands in his sketchbook. I still visit a psychologist, trying to forget about this incident, to not think that I could have lost my hands, or worse, and above all, to forget that this boy was my classmate.
During the late 90s, I was at a very low point in my life. I was a drug addict wandering the streets of downtown Los Angeles, eating out of trash cans, sleeping under bridges, and asking random bypassers for spare change. Looking back, I have nothing but regret for that time in my life, but this story is about the incident that made me sober up and turn my life around. One night, I was sleeping under a secluded highway overpass. It was fairly isolated because of its location on the outskirts of the city, and saw little to no police presence. My sleeping spot overlooked a concrete foundation that had stretched on for about 50 yards. It was a pretty long walk to get back to the city from this area, so after a long day of panhandling, I slipped into my sleeping bag and began to doze off. I was suddenly woken up by the sounds of screaming. I turned on my side to see a car parked under the overpass. There were no lights on, but the vehicle's windows were down, and I could tell that there was a commotion taking place inside the cab. Now, I know what you might be thinking. At first, I thought the same thing too. Maybe someone was getting lucky, but these were not screams of pleasure. They were screams of agony. I watched in horror as the passenger side door of the car then flung open, and a skimpily dressed woman exited the car. She was holding her leg and was trying her best to limp away from the car. I was frozen in place, almost not believing what I was witnessing. The girl was begging for her life as she awkwardly staggered away from the vehicle. The driver's side door then opened and a figure emerged from the car. The person that emerged from the car then pointed a gun at the girl, then shot her. I remember closing my eyes as soon as the gun went off, and then opening them to see the woman sprawled out on the ground. She was on her back, and the way her head was positioned was as if she was looking at me. Her jaw was going up and down like she was trying to say something. The memory of seeing her like that, well, it still really haunts me. The shooter made his way over to her. When he stepped into the light, I could see that he was wearing a dark hooded jacket with a bandana hiding his face. He stood over her and just watched her for several seconds, then finishing her off with the second shot. I was absolutely petrified at what I had just witnessed. I was now sitting up in my sleeping bag with one hand over my mouth, just trying my best to not make a sound. But what happened next was a whole new level of fucked up. The headlights of another vehicle at the opposite end of the overpass flicked on and drove up to the gruesome scene. At first I was relieved, and I stupidly thought that these people were there to help, not even factoring in that a bystander wouldn't just casually drive up to the scene of a crime with a killer still there with a loaded gun. But things became clear to me once I noticed that the other vehicle was a black van. And things became even more clear once I saw 3 men wearing ski masks exiting the van, with one of them holding a video camera. These sick fucks were filming this entire thing. There was an exchange of words, and the other 2 men that exited the van walked over to the dead woman and grabbed her arms and legs, then proceeded to carry her body back to the car. The shooter had made his way over to the car before they got there, and the cameraman stepped off to the side and filmed the entire thing. The shooter popped open the trunk, and the men heaved the corpse into it. The cameraman then joined them at the car for a nice close-up shot. The shooter then walked over to the van, then returned with 2 gas cans. The men doused the car in gasoline, and the shooter struck a match and threw it, and the car was instantly engulfed in flames. The 4 men and myself watched as the car burned. As I stared into the fire, I became numb. I had apparently reached my scare limit, and now I was just angry at these animals for what they had done. Even if the woman was an addict or a hooker, no one deserves to die like that, murdered under an overpass in cold blood. The fact that there were others there filming the whole thing pissed me off even more. The 4 men eventually piled back into the van, then left. A short while later, I had emerged from the overpass and made my way to the nearest payphone to call the police. I don't think the police took me seriously at first, until I led them to the burning car. I was questioned for hours by detectives, and yes, they did suspect me, a homeless junkie, of foul play, but I stuck to my story. They did keep me in a holding cell for a few days, which they probably couldn't legally do, but I honestly didn't really mind at all. Free showers and food. I was actually a bit bummed out when they eventually released me. I later found out that there were similar killings in San Francisco and Sacramento, and that the perpetrators were wanted by the FBI. I don't know for sure if they ever caught them. I only hope that they did. After that night, I decided that I had enough of living on the streets. The fear I experienced inspired me to get my shit together, finish college, and become an English teacher. I'm proud to say that I've been sober for over 23 years. Sometimes seeing the ugliest side of humanity, well, I think that's the cure.
This happened to myself and a friend of mine. We're both 23-year-old males. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking camping trip to the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We are both very comfortable with nature and spend a lot of time outside hunting, camping, and fishing. We hiked about 5 miles to get to a small lake so we could set up camp on the beach. We didn't really expect to run into anyone else. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake around 10:30. This was fairly unusual. However, we did not think much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night. We did not want to deal with any unwelcomed guests. Once it was clear that the person, or people, were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the nearby woods to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me and my friend had a .22 rifle. Now we weren't expecting any trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it's one man. He has a beard and was probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was that he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around our campsite a few times, and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for about a minute, he came out and started yelling,
"I know you're out there. Why don't you come and say hello?"
My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. That's when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing that we had drying near the fire and threw them in to burn. My friend had the .22 rifle trained at the man. He asked me if he should shoot. I told him absolutely not, unless he spots us and starts pointing the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man moved off after a while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake. Then we ran out and grabbed everything we could fit in my pack and took off. It was now 2 or 3 a.m. We ran out the trail with our flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, where we also spoke with some forest rangers. And that was it. I still haven't heard anything back from the police, and this experience creeped the hell out of both of us. I used to live in this small, sleepy forest town, which at the time was notorious for being the most boring place to raise a family in the Midwest. That never bothered me very much. I liked the isolation and the privacy, and the knowledge that those late-breaking violent stories you hear on the news would never involve us. I lived about a minute away from a large open field, where I could easily walk for about 15 minutes without ever having to set foot on concrete. One day last summer, I was taking my dog Oscar for a walk across the field, pretty early in the morning as I usually did. But today, something happened to catch my eye immediately after I went through the fence. About 15 meters to the left of the entry gate is an old fishing pit that was surrounded by overgrown bushes with barbed wire. So I heard something rustling from the undergrowth, and I stopped to investigate. I noticed the outline of someone standing under the shadows of the trees, staring at me without moving. Completely taken aback and slightly unnerved, I decided to just keep walking my dog as if I hadn't seen anything. I usually play music on my phone, but after that chilling encounter, I had no intention of doing so, just in case that person decided to try and come at me from behind. After walking for another 15 minutes, I completed my loop around the field and was making my way back when I noticed a tall man walking from the grassy area around the fishing pit to the gate. It was hard to tell because of the distance, but I would say he was around 30 years old and well built. I made sure to keep my distance and decided to play fetch with my dog for a while and give him time to leave, as my gut feeling was telling me that it wasn't a good idea to approach him. After a short while, I made sure the coast was clear and called my dog back over to me and reattached his leash. As we were making our way out of the field through the gate where we originally entered, Oscar started pulling at his leash and sniffing around the bushes where I had first noticed the silhouette of the man. I tugged at the leash and called my dog's name, but he refused to obey, which was strange because he usually didn't give me any trouble. I walked towards him to grab his collar, nervously scanning the area again for the strange man, when I noticed a piece of blue cloth on the other side of the barbed wire divider that surrounds the fishing pit. I tied my dog to a nearby stump, carefully climbed over the fence, and went to investigate. This next part is very difficult for me to recount, because while a part of me is pleased my actions that day brought light to a violent crime and brought closure, however horrific, to someone's family, another part of me wishes I had just been less patient and kept tugging at my dog, because the nightmares have yet to stop. There was a body of a young girl covered in bruises all over her face and lacerations to her wrists. Fresh blood was pooling under the gash in her neck. Her eyes were all puffy like she had been crying for a very long time. I couldn't even begin to imagine what she had been put through. After calling the police, I sat by the gate and waited what was probably only about 8 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Even though I obviously knew she was dead, When I overheard the ambulance attendant confirm it, I threw up all over the grass. The police tried asking me questions, and I told them what I could recall about the stranger, while my dog whined and tried to nuzzle me while I sat on the grass. A week later, I read in the newspaper that the young girl was a 12-year-old named Megan that had gone missing no more than 5 minutes away from my house. She had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. After 3 months of continuous searching, nobody matched the vague description of the man I had given the police. More than a few times, I've noticed people in my own town giving me sideways glances that feel more like suspicion than pity, and that's almost more than I can bear. Please just remember to keep things in perspective, no matter how shitty a day you're having. However many trivial inconveniences you have to endure, you were at least lucky enough not to have found a dead child while enjoying your daily routine. My thoughts and prayers go out to that poor girl's family.
This story is about my ex-girlfriend. She was a lovely woman whom I met about 5 years ago when I was 20 years old. I loved her with all my heart. However, I was getting tired of her growing obsession and violent behavior. I realized that her mental age was lower than the average person's, and whenever she got angry, she cursed me with what she called a magic wand. I then had to pretend to be under her spell and suffer from it. I couldn't stand it, so I broke up with her. She didn't take it well and started stalking me for almost a year. "I will dedicate your soul to the devil." She cursed me with these words, and since then, there's always been a dead body of a mouse or a cat in front of my house. Eventually, I blocked all contact and managed to escape from her. However, she eventually showed up in front of me 5 years later. We ran into each other at a friend's party and she greeted me with a familiar, lovely face. Seeing that, I felt like I had forgotten all of my past wounds. It was nice to see her rather than hate her. It almost seemed as if nothing had happened. Then she suddenly asked me to have dinner sometime. At first, I wanted to say no, but then decided to accept her offer as I thought it would be okay to just have dinner with her. Surprisingly, she was very kind and didn't show any violent tendencies like in the past. We had a great time at the restaurant, and after the meal, she suggested going to her house for another drink. I accepted the offer as my caution against her had been lifted. However, I was surprised to see the state of her house when I arrived. The floor was littered with trash and dolls as if it hadn't been cleaned for months, and there was this unknown stench from somewhere hitting my nose. But she acted so casually that I, who was freaked out at the moment, pretended that everything was fine. Then, there was one thing that caught my eye. Through the slightly open door of her room, I could see an awl stuck through a doll. I was horrified for a moment, but tried not to show my fear. While she brought us a drink and we drank together, I was thinking about how to get out of there. She must have noticed something strange too. Her expression started to stiffen. She then went to the bathroom for a while. In the meantime, I went into a room to check what was inside. And when I saw what it was, I dropped my can of beer. Dozens of dolls, not just one, were stuck through with an awl. The creepy thing was, some of the dolls had pictures of men on their faces, and mine was there too. The doll's belly was torn apart and its arms and legs were also torn. I could see deadly weapons, dog necklaces, and a whip on the desk. I realized that something terrible would happen if I didn't get out of there. Just then, I heard her voice behind me. "Finally, I got you." She was smiling brightly when I turned around with a deadly pale face. "I finally got you." She had a net and a Pokeball from Pokemon in both her hands. "Come to me." Smiling brightly, she stretched out her arm. As I stood there with an absurd expression, her expression slowly began to stiffen. Then she picked up the knife from the desk and jumped at me. Ah! I screamed, pushed her off, and ran like crazy.
Come back, honey! You're mine! Leaving her scream behind me, I ran out. Just then, I felt like I heard someone moan in another room. But I ran away anyway and immediately called the police. To my surprise, 2 men were found inside when police rushed into her house. They were dressed in animal clothes, had a dog necklace around their necks, and ate with a dog bowl. It turned out that they were all her ex-boyfriends. Being stabbed and wounded, they were held in captivity at her home for weeks. Luckily, they were rescued, and she was eventually arrested. To this day, I'm still suffering from the terrible memories of that time. If I hadn't gotten away from her, I would have become one of her Pokemon. It happened when I was in high school. I went to see an abandoned house with my friend. I was wandering around the house with him, but there wasn't much there. Just then, I found light leaking from the stairway down to the basement. When we went down the stairs to the basement, there was a man. No, it wasn't a man. It was a devil. The moment I saw him, I couldn't lift a finger. My whole body was stiff. As soon as my friend saw his face, he ran away with unbelievable speed. I thought it was a dream, but it was a clear reality. His face, skin, and eyes were all reddish. He was the devil himself. When he looked at me, he smiled and said softly, "Oh, the lamb is lost. Do you know where this place is?" Holding a whip in one hand, he came close. Looking closely, I could see what was wrong with his skin. He had terrible burns all over his body. I mumbled, "Oh God." "There is no God, so I became the son of the devil." As he approached, I was immediately struck by the smell of blood. I think he was some sort of Satanist. There were various items symbolizing Satan, paintings of goats, snakes, and other reptiles. "Believe in Satan, then you shall receive everything you want, as long as you devote your soul to him." He held out a glass full of blood to me. "Take of all the pleasures and desires you want. Everything will be yours." Then he started uttering some spell in an ancient language. "Tana bolak tidin, soba tahilgo no pepera hadil, das varubes hotele begrablam." Just then, I felt a strong urge to drink it. I don't know why, but I almost did it. However, I came to my senses and refused. He then laughed and drank the blood. A moment later, he grabbed my face with his hand and vomited blood on it. "Drink it! Satan wants your body!" I freaked out and barely covered my face with my arms. The blood he spat out spread everywhere. Again, he put a cup to my mouth and tried to make me drink the rest of the blood. Desperately closing my mouth shut, I pushed him off and ran away. I finally climbed the stairs and ran outside instantaneously. I knew something bad would happen if I stayed there for another minute. He stood still behind me, not catching me running away, just chanting spells in a devilish voice. Just then, I heard thousands of people scream painfully in the back. I felt like I was in the pit of hell, but I knew that there was just me and him. When I came out, everything was calm again, as if nothing had happened. Leaves swaying in the wind, birds flying. Everything seemed peaceful. I felt so weird. Could there be another world that exists that I don't know? To this day, my doubts are not gone. He had already escaped when the cops arrived on the scene. Only the bodies of the dead snakes and reptiles were found. Even now, he sometimes appears in my dreams and seduces me. He crams a cup of blood into my mouth and I wake up struggling desperately. And when I wake up, I feel the taste of blood and suffer from a massive thirst for it. To tell the truth, I'm afraid that my soul will be taken by Satan one day. Dear God, please save me from this fear.